From Seattle, Washington, this is Democracy Now!
Why did you fire Director Comey?
Because he wasn't doing a good job, very simply. He was not doing a good job.
Did President Trump fire FBI Director James Comey just days after Comey asked the Justice Department for more resources to investigate the Trump campaign's ties to Russia before the 2016 election? We'll speak with New York University history professor Ruth Ben-Gia, who argues this could be Trump at his most dangerous. Her book in progress is titled Strong Men, From Mussolini to Trump. We'll also get response from socialist Seattle City Council member Kshama Sawant. Then we speak to one of the lawyers leading the charge against Trump's Muslim ban.
And in fact, it's absurd on his face if you look at it and say, how in the world can he be trying to tie this to national security when he's barring children from coming in to be reunited with their parents who are already living here, their parents who are United States citizens and lawful permanent residents.
We'll speak with Matt Adams, legal director for the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. He's also fighting an order from the Department of Justice that instructs his groups to cease and desist from assisting unrepresented immigrants facing deportation. And the Department of Energy has declared a state of emergency at the Hanford nuclear site here in Washington state, after a tunnel storing contaminated radioactive materials collapsed, forcing hundreds of workers to take cover in place to avoid potential exposure.
You see an excavator here that throughout the day will place scoopful after scoopful of soil into the collapsed portion of that tunnel, which is approximately here. Important to know, again, we're doing this focused on employee safety. There's been no reports of radiological contamination so far, no employee injuries.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. More details are coming to light about President Trump's firing of FBI Director James Comey. The New York Times is reporting Comey's dismissal came just days after he asked the Justice Department for more resources to expand the Bureau's investigation into Russia's meddling in the presidential election. Comey made the appeal to Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, the same official who wrote the memo Trump later used to justify Comey's firing. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports Rosenstein has threatened to resign after the White House cast him as the main instigator in the firing of Comey. The White House has given conflicting explanations as to why Comey was dismissed. Privately, White House aides say Trump was infuriated by Comey's recent congressional testimony about the FBI probe into Russia. But during a press briefing on Wednesday, Deputy White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders accused Comey of committing atrocities while investigating former Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server.
I think also having a letter like the one that he received and having that conversation that outlined the basic just atrocities in circumventing the chain of command in the Department of Justice.
On Capitol Hill, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has rejected calls from Senate Democrats for a special prosecutor. Meanwhile, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer warned Comey's firing is part of a troubling pattern.
This is part of a deeply troubling pattern from the Trump administration. They fired Sally Yates. They fired Preet Bharara. And now they fired Director Comey, the very man leading the investigation. This does not seem to be a coincidence.
In his first public comment since his dismissal, former FBI Director James Comey urged agents at the FBI to remain, quote, a rock of competence, honesty, and independence. In the letter, Comey went on to say, quote, I have long believed that a president can fire an FBI director for any reason or for no reason at all. I'm not going to spend time on the decision or the way it was executed. I hope you won't either, he wrote. Meanwhile, the Senate Intelligence Committee has issued a subpoena to Donald Trump's former national security advisor, General Mike Flynn, for documents regarding his interactions with Russian officials, including Russia's ambassador to the U.S., Sergei Kislyak. Senate investigators have also sought documents from Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, former campaign foreign policy advisor Carter Page, and former advisor Roger Stone. These developments all occurred on the same day that President Trump hosted Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Russia's ambassador Sergei Kislyak at the White House to talk about Syria and other issues. Politico reports Trump invited Lavrov after a request from Russian President Vladimir Putin. A White House spokesman said, quote, he chose to receive him because Putin asked him to. Putin did specifically ask on the call when they last talked. The White House faced some criticism for allowing the Russian state media agency TASS inside the White House to take photographs while barring all U.S. media. Trump also spent part of the day on Wednesday morning with Henry Kissinger, who served as President Richard Nixon's Secretary of State. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos was repeatedly booed and heckled Wednesday when she addressed graduating seniors at Bethune-Cookman University, a historically black college in Florida. Many students turned their backs on DeVos.
Dr. Jackson, Board of Trustees, thank you so very, very much for this great honor and privilege. I am honored to become a Wildcat. And it's a real honor and privilege to be with you as we celebrate the Bethune-Cookman University class of 2017.
As the booing of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos grew louder, school president Edison Jackson interrupted her commencement address to issue a warning to students.
If this behavior continues, your degrees will be mailed to you.
Despite the warning, many students kept booing with their backs turned to DeVos. More than 60,000 people had signed petitions opposing the selection of DeVos as commencement speaker at Bethune-Cookman University. DeVos was widely criticized in February when she said historically black colleges and universities are, quote, real pioneers when it comes to school choice. Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price has defended the recent arrest of a journalist in West Virginia who attempted to ask him a question in the hallway of the West Virginia State Capitol. Dan Heyman of Public News Service was arrested and jailed on $5,000 bail after he repeatedly asked Price whether domestic violence would be categorized as a pre-existing condition under the new Republican health care plan. On Wednesday, Price said the arrest was justified.
I want to commend the West Virginia Capitol Police. They did what they felt was appropriate. We thank them for the work that they do. It's important to appreciate that gentleman was not in a press conference. We were walking down a hall, and the Capitol Police acted as they felt necessary, and I would refer any questions to them.
The reporter's name is Dan Hyman. In other news from Washington, the head of the Census Bureau has unexpectedly resigned, just as the department prepares for the 2020 census, which will determine how many seats each state gets in Congress. John Thompson had served in the post since 2013. In a surprising victory for environmentalists, the Senate has rejected a resolution to revoke an Obama-era rule to limit methane emissions from oil and gas production on federal lands. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas directly linked to global warming. 3 Republicans voted against the bill: John McCain of Arizona, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, and Susan Collins of Maine. In other environmental news, the North Carolina House has voted 74-40 to override Governor Roy Cooper's veto of a bill that would have shielded factory farms from damages brought by residents sickened by hog farms. The bill now goes to the North Carolina Senate. Residents have long complained about pork producers who collect billions of gallons of untreated pig feces and urine in cesspools, then dispose of the waste by spraying it into the air. You can go to our website, DemocracyNow.org, to see an extended discussion about factory hog farms in North Carolina. A new study is predicting Glacier National Park will be glacier-free in the coming decades. In the late 19th century, the park, which is in Montana's Rocky Mountains, had 150 glaciers. Today, the number is down to 26, and many of those are rapidly shrinking. In South Korea, Moon Jae-in has been sworn in as the country's new president. In his inaugural address, the former human rights lawyer vowed to bring peace to the Korean peninsula.
I will urgently try to solve the security crisis. I'll be always on the move for peace in the Korean peninsula. If necessary, I will fly straight to Washington. I will go to Beijing and Tokyo, and if the conditions allow, to Pyongyang as well.
The United Nations is reporting as many as 245 refugees died last weekend in a pair of shipwrecks off the coast of Libya. So far, more than 1,300 people have died this year trying to cross the Mediterranean from Libya. On Wednesday, the Libyan Coast Guard intercepted nearly 500 refugees packed onto a wooden boat and returned them to Tripoli. The refugees were attempting to reach a boat operated by the European NGO Sea-Watch. One of the refugees had fled the violence in Syria.
I have been trying to migrate to Europe for the past 6 months to rejoin my children. I left the war in Syria and went to Jordan, where I did not benefit from anything, as it is still an Arab country. I went then to Lebanon, where I was not accepted. Egypt was the same, and Sudan was the same. I then went to Libya, which was also in a war similar to Syria's. I am now trying to go to Europe for my children, and because Europe respects human rights. Arabs do not have human rights. They have no more humanity.
Meanwhile, in news from Syria, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is reporting U.S.-led airstrikes have killed at least 11 people, including 4 children in a village north of the Syrian city of Raqqa. In New York, hundreds of students and faculty at Stony Brook University on Long Island held sit-ins and demonstrations Wednesday to protest the proposed $1.5 million budget cuts to the humanities and language departments. The cuts would particularly affect the Hispanic languages and cultural studies. This is one of the students speaking at Wednesday's protest.
My name is Gabriel Rudas. I'm a graduate student from the Hispanic Languages and Literature Department. We came here to protest against the irrational cuts Professor Sasha Kopp is doing against our department. We stand for the high quality of the research and for diversity, and we think that these cuts are discriminatory measure taken against the Latino community.
Mother's Day protests were held across Mexico Wednesday. Mothers held up portraits of their missing children and demanded the government do more to find their sons and daughters. Amnesty International estimates more than 27,000 people have disappeared or gone missing in Mexico in recent years. Marchers included Delia Garcia, whose son was kidnapped more than 7 years ago.
Tell us where our children are. It's a feeling of desperation. With the passing of time, the pain is more unbearable. But here we are fighting. We will keep coming until we die.
And in New Orleans, city officials removed a statue this morning of former Confederate President Jefferson Davis. This marks the second Confederate monument to come down in the city after a city council vote in 2015. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Seattle, Washington. More details are coming to light about President Trump's firing of FBI Director James Comey. The New York Times is reporting Comey's dismissal came just days after he asked the Justice Department for more resources to expand the Bureau's investigation into Russia's meddling in the presidential election. Comey made the appeal to Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who wrote the memo President Trump later used to justify Comey's firing. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports Rosenstein has threatened to quit after the White House cast him as the main instigator in the firing of Comey. The White House has given conflicting explanations as to why Comey was dismissed. During a press briefing Wednesday, Deputy White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders said Comey committed atrocities when investigating former Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton's emails and cited the letter from Rosenstein as having contributed to Trump's decision to fire Comey now.
I think also having a letter like the one that he received and having that conversation that outlined the basic just atrocities in circumventing the chain of command in the Department of Justice.
When Huckabee was asked when President Trump lost confidence in Comey, this was her response.
I think that Director Comey has shown over the last several months and, frankly, the last year, a lot of missteps and mistakes. And certainly, I think that, as you've seen from many of the comments from Democrat members, including Senator Schumer, they didn't think he should be there. They thought he should be gone. Frankly, I think it's startling that Democrats aren't celebrating this since they've been calling for it for so long.
Meanwhile, on Wednesday, President Trump met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in the Oval Office. Among those participating in the meeting were Russian Ambassador to the U.S. Sergei Kislyak, whose contacts with Trump advisors are under investigation by the FBI, and former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. After Trump's opening remarks, a reporter asked him why he fired FBI Director Comey.
Everybody knows Dr. Kissinger. And we're right now talking about Russia and various other matters. But it's an honor to have Henry Kissinger with us. He's been a friend of mine for a long time. And thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it.
Why did you fire Director Comey? Why did you fire Director Comey?
Because he wasn't doing a good job, very simply. He was not doing a good job.
As a candidate, Donald Trump cheered Comey's tough stance on Clinton's use of a personal email and private internet server while she was Secretary of State. Trump is the first president since Richard Nixon to fire a law enforcement official who was overseeing an investigation tied to the White House. President Bill Clinton dismissed William Sessions amidst allegations of ethical lapses in 1993. As the developments fuel concerns Trump is trying to undermine a probe that could threaten his presidency, Capitol Hill Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell rejected calls for a special prosecutor into the Russia investigation that came from outraged Democrats like Vermont Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy.
This is not just a scandal. The president's actions are neither Republican nor Democratic. They're authoritarian. This is an effort to undo the ties that bind our democratic form of government. All of us, both sides of the aisle, must now put country over party.
In his first public comment on his firing, former FBI Director James Comey wrote a letter to agents at the FBI urging them to remain, quote, a rock of competence, honesty, and independence, noting, quote, I have long believed that a president can fire an FBI director for any reason or for no reason at all. I'm not going to spend time on the decision or the way it was executed. I hope you won't either, he wrote. All of this comes as the Senate Intelligence Committee Wednesday subpoenaed former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn for documents related to its investigation into Russia's election meddling. Former FBI Director Comey was supposed to be a star witness for the committee, but acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe will now testify instead. For more, we go to New York. We're joined by Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. She wrote a recent piece for CNN headlined, Trump at His Most Dangerous. She's currently working on a book entitled Strongmen, From Mussolini to Trump. Professor, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you talk about, first, the firing and your thoughts as you see this go down? President Trump firing the FBI Director James Comey, who was investigating the Trump campaign.
Sure. You know, some people, including Republicans, are now trying to spin this as Trump being Trump, an impulsive action that was just out of grievance. I see it differently. Trump is an authoritarian, as I've been arguing for some time. And when he says that Comey wasn't doing his job, he means Comey was obstructing him from using the office of the presidency to further his personal goals, because authoritarians believe that the institutions should serve them and not the other way around. So I see this as completely consistent with his temperament and his agenda of colonizing the country to make it serve his personal interest.
Can you talk about the ways you see this trend of authoritarianism being expressed by Trump? I mean, he's only been in office now for a few months.
Sure. Well, it's during the campaign, he started with a very important, point, which was forging these bonds with the public that were based on loyalty to him. And it's come up repeatedly that he felt Comey wasn't loyal to him, and loyalty is the most important thing. Because authoritarians forge bonds that are based on their person and not allegiance to a party or a principle. Trump doesn't care too much about the GOP. It got him to power. It gave him the nomination, but it's just a vehicle for him. So that's part of it. The other thing is a former senior intelligence official said that the way that he fired Comey was like an execution, in quotes. And, the method, and he did it. Trump is he's a proponent of the doctrine of surprise. And this was a kind of threat to the FBI, to the American public, which is consistent with the kind of dangerous persona he has had. And I want to remind everyone that in January 2016, when he was on the campaign trail, he said, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and wouldn't lose any followers. This was, for me, a turning point. It meant that he was giving us a message that he considered himself to be above the law. And he was testing the GOP, which is what authoritarians do. They test on their way up, and once they're in power, to see how much they can get away with. And the GOP rewarded him with the nomination. So he feels emboldened, now he's in power, to do exactly this kind of thing.
I want to go to Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, the Democrat of New York.
This is part of a deeply troubling pattern from the Trump administration. They fired Sally Yates. They fired Preet Bharara. And now they fired Director Comey, the very man leading the investigation. This does not seem to be a coincidence.
And speaking on CNN Wednesday, Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut called the Trump decision to fire Comey a looming constitutional crisis.
I disagree with James Comey in some of his decisions, but I never advocated that he be fired, particularly before an inspector general within the Department of Justice was looking at those actions. Rod Rosenstein, in effect, preempted that ongoing internal investigation, fired him using a pretense that is laughable, the decisions on the Clinton email some 10 months ago. And what we have now is really a looming constitutional crisis that is deadly serious.
President Trump lashed out at Senator Blumenthal. Instead of addressing the comments, Trump attacked Blumenthal's military record in a series of tweets. Trump wrote, quote, watching Senator Richard Blumenthal speak of Comey as a joke, Richie devised one of the greatest military frauds in U.S. history. For years, as a poll in Connecticut, Blumenthal would talk of his great bravery and conquest in Vietnam, except he wasn't there. When caught, he cried like a baby and begged for forgiveness, and now he's a judge and jury. He should be the one who's investigated for his acts. Well, Senator Blumenthal returned to CNN later on Wednesday and was asked by Anderson Cooper how serious this could get.
It may well produce another United States versus Nixon on a subpoena that went to the United States Supreme Court. It may well produce impeachment proceedings, although we're very far from that possibility.
So, Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, can you talk about what these senators are saying and what you see might be, though you would be quite prescient if you could say, what's about to unfold?
Yes, no one can tell what's going to happen. In the past, once elites are co-opted to an authoritarian, it can be very difficult for pragmatic reasons for them to jump ship. This is not, strictly speaking, a constitutional crisis in that it was perfectly legal for Trump to fire the FBI director. What's at issue is the politicization of the judiciary and intelligence, and which he's been doing all along, and the method. And so this depends on what the GOP is going to do, and I'm a bit pessimistic about their having the political will, the unified political will to see this through to get rid of Trump. I also want to highlight, though, that the comparison with Watergate leaves out the very, very important foreign dimension. This is a Russia Trump-Russia probe. And firing Comey in the way he did was a very important message that Trump sent to the world. Number one, to all of his fellow authoritarians, and we've seen how he calls the president of Turkey. He invites Duterte of the Philippines to the White House, and he has gone out of his way to forge ties and show allegiance to this kind of leadership, and above all to his Russian client. And I felt it was such a tragedy for our democracy to see Trump in the Oval Office with the Russian foreign minister the day after this happened. This is a very strong signal to his Russian client and to authoritarians all over the world that he means business, and the business is their business.
I mean, it's very interesting. The headline I just read at the top of the show, yes, on the same day President Trump hosted the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Russia's ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, at the White House. Political reports Trump invited Lavrov after a request from Russian President Putin. A White House spokesman said he chose to receive him because Putin asked him to. Putin did specifically ask on the call when they last talked. The White House faced some criticism for allowing the Russian state media agency TASS inside the White House to take photographs while barring all U.S. media. Your thoughts?
I felt terribly sad for our democracy when I saw that. Being also a historian of propaganda, you cannot overestimate the impact of acquiescing to a request to have the foreign minister in there. And apparently, news reports are that Trump was duped a bit because he was told the photographer was the personal photographer of the foreign minister, when in fact the person was also taking pictures for TASS, the state agency. And think of the impact that has within Russia and the world, and the U.S. media was not allowed in. And besides the security concerns which have been raised with having Russians in the Oval Office with a photographer into the most sensitive space of America, it sends a message that Russia has won and that Trump is indeed willing to do what they say. So I felt this was a great tragedy and a kind of culmination of all the things that have been said and alleged during this Russia-Trump investigation so far.
Professor Ben-Ghiat, you are a professor of history and Italian studies at NYU, New York University, and you're writing a book comparing Trump to Mussolini. Can you explain?
Yes. So I'm pushed many times in the media to label Trump a fascist. And I've never done that because Trump is not aiming to establish a one-party state. It's too much work, I imagine, and he doesn't need to. The thing about authoritarians today, and we can look at what's happening in Turkey and elsewhere, and even in Russia, you don't need to have a dictatorship in the classic sense to accomplish your goals. You can intimidate people, you can try and control the press, you can attack the judiciary, the media, the institutions, hollowing them out without having to ban parties in the traditional fascist manner. That said, there are many similarities. One of them I mentioned before. There's this testing period constantly that the authoritarian is doing to see how much he can get away with. What is the appetite of the political elites and the public for violence? And this goes back to Trump's comment, right, that he could shoot someone. This is quite extraordinary. And Mussolini did the same thing, as did Hitler. And the other element is that people don't take these people seriously until it's too late. So I've been trying to warn the public, along with many other people, about the dangers, including this article you mentioned most recently, the dangers that these men bring with them. And by the time people realize, it's too late.
Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. We'll link to your piece over at CNN, headline, Trump at his most dangerous. Professor Ben-Ghiat is working on a book called Strong Men, From Mussolini to Trump. When we come back, Kshama Sawant joins us, the Socialist City Council member here in Seattle, Washington. Stay with us.
Sweetness, I was only joking when I said I
Big mouth strikes again by the Smiths. Here on Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in Seattle, Washington. I'll be back in New York tomorrow, speaking at the New School tomorrow night. But right now, we continue our coverage of President Trump's firing of FBI Director James Comey. The New York Times is reporting Comey's dismissal came just days after he asked the Justice Department for more resources to expand the Bureau's investigation into Russia's meddling in the presidential election. Speaking to Fox News, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich defended Trump's decision to fire Comey.
The key fact is that the brand new Deputy Attorney General, who is a 30-year career professional in the Justice Department, who was President Barack Obama's U.S. Attorney for Maryland, who was just 2 weeks ago endorsed by the Senate 94-6. This is the person who wrote the letter, which is devastating, and said that it's clear that Comey cannot lead the FBI, that he has made such a significant series of mistakes that it has crippled the morale of the FBI. And in that letter, he goes through citing Attorney General after Attorney General after Attorney General, all of them saying what Comey's done violates totally the FBI.
Well, for more, we're joined by Kshama Sawant, a Socialist City Council member here in Seattle, Washington, where we're broadcasting from. Sawant's helped win a $15 an hour minimum wage for all workers in Seattle. Also, she's a member of the Socialist Alternative. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Kshama Sawant. Can you respond to President Trump's firing of James Comey, who many Democrats have attacked for a long time, feeling that he actually meddled in the 2016 election by going after Hillary Clinton, or saying publicly the FBI was, and yet now we know he at the same time was going after Donald Trump, but never mentioned this?
Right. Thank you for having me, Amy. And it's true that the firing of James Comey is an extremely significant political event. It definitely puts on display the authoritarian streak of the Trump administration, his billionaire-backed right-wing administration. And it also shows an administration in deep crisis. And it is completely correct that a lot of ordinary people, working people around us, are talking about this as, you know, is there a potential to maybe start impeachment proceedings on Trump? There is also this whole question in the media, I think correctly so, whether there's a whiff of the Nixon-era Watergate scandal in what's happening today. And I think, as I said, there's some truth to that. But I would say that as far as ordinary working people, people like us, people like most of the people watching this show are concerned, I don't think the most important question is whether or not a certain FBI director was fired, and I'll say why. Because the FBI itself is part of a racist and repressive security and state apparatus. It has a long track record of targeting activists, black activists. So at the end of the day, the larger question is not so much about that, but about what this indicates as far as the status of the administration is concerned and what should we be doing about it. I think a lot of people correctly want Trump out. I want Trump out, but I want Trump, the Republicans, the billionaire class, and the security state out of power. How do we accomplish that? So in addition to the Watergate as a memory from the Nixon era, I would say there's another very, very relevant educational memory that we should draw upon from the Nixon era. It was during Nixon's regime in the White House that we had one of the most historic eras of social and political and workers' movements. It was when Nixon was in the White House that we had the Environmental Protection Agency formed, the Occupational Safety and Health Act that was passed, the Supreme Court pro-abortion decision, Roe v. Wade, landmark decision was passed, and the Vietnam War was ended, and there were massive strike actions by workers. But none of this was because of Nixon in any way. He was a misogynist, racist, right-wing president. It was because movements were drawing the correct conclusions that it is time to really build on our own independent strength. And I think we can do that right now as well. And so in relation to Comey, I would say that it is really indicative of the deep instability of his administration. But we as ordinary people, as social movements, we cannot wait for whether or not there will be a smoking gun that will be found in the investigations, which of course should go forward. the question is, what do we do now? And I think that right now, the time is ripe to really build social movements. I don't know if your viewers saw this, but one of the sociologists recently in America said that there is no protest fatigue happening right now. That's the wrong conclusion to draw. Actually, people are starting to come into a state of revolt like never before in our generations, at least. And you can see the rise of the popularity of socialism among younger generations. The strike actions on May 1st were very significant, and ultimately a very strong indicator of what's already happened in Trump's regime is the airport actions that happened in late January that were a decisive factor, the civil disobedience and peaceful shutdown of airports. That was a decisive factor in giving Trump his first stinging defeat on his attempted Muslim ban. I think we need more of those kinds of social movements. And right now, if people are sitting up and taking notice, it's correct, and let's get organized.
Well, I wanted to turn right now to Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, responding to Trump's decision to fire FBI Director James Comey.
I think it is a situation where the president is impeding a significant investigation to determine whether, in fact, there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. As you know, Russia has been interfering in elections big time in Germany, in the Ukraine, many countries around the world. Our intelligence agencies all agree that they interfered significantly in the American election. They were in France last week trying to elect Le Pen, a very right-wing individual. So this is an investigation that has to go forward in a nonpartisan way.
Your thoughts on what Senator Sanders said and where you feel movements need to go from here. There's also discussions about the possibility of this being the beginning of the end, the possibility of impeachment, though that would take a lot of Republicans coming on board. And what would make that happen, Kshama Sawant?
Right. I completely agree with Bernie Sanders that the investigations into the Russian involvement in the election process in the U.S. should be investigated completely, thoroughly, in a nonpartisan basis. But I would say that, if we're talking about interference in elections, look at the interference that the U.S. regime, the U.S. ruling class has carried out year after year, decade after decade in other countries, especially neo-colonial countries. And so we have to be clear here. We should be absolutely clear that we're not on the side of Putin. We have no illusions in Putin. He's an odious and oppressive figure. And actually, working people who are, joining protest movements in the U.S., we should be in solidarity with the working people, young people in Russia who are courageously, at grave danger to their personal lives, speaking out against Putin. But we should see this not so much from a nationalistic standpoint, and rather from the standpoint of what's happening all across the world, especially in the United States and in Europe. Everywhere, what you're seeing, and including with the starting to the crisis of the Trump regime. Bernie Sanders mentioned the election, but in France, but the right-winger Marine Le Pen wasn't elected. Macron was elected, but the reality is that the vast majority of people who voted for Macron in France said that they voted because they wanted to keep the right wing out. They have no illusions in the neoliberal apparatus that will be upheld by Macron. So what we're seeing on both sides of the Atlantic really is a whole new generation in a historic period of revolt. The vast majority of young people actually in Europe in a recent survey said that they're far more likely to participate in an uprising than to vote. So in reality, what message we should be drawing from the crisis in the Trump regime, the crumbling of the legitimacy of the ruling classes everywhere, is that this is exactly the moment for us to build our movements, not to be complacent, not to wait for an impeachment to happen, but to recognize that Trump, as vicious as he is, as vicious as his right-wing billionaire-backed administration is, we can defeat him. We have shown it through the airport actions. We have shown through the revolt that happened against the earlier version of Trump Care that this can be done. But I think it's a question of strategy. So as far as what Sanders said, I think it's really important that Sanders is a figure in this discussion, because we are, if you're talking about the most important issue for Americans right now, it's healthcare. The newest version of Trump Care was just passed to the House. So what is our strategy to fight against Trump Care? I would say that the biggest reason that Trump and the Republicans and the right wing are able to push through newer and newer versions of vicious attacks on healthcare is because we have no real alternative to keep out the for-profit industry. And so really the only alternative is to fight for single-payer Medicare for all. A majority of Americans want publicly funded affordable health care. A majority, and certainly a vast majority of Democrats, want single payer.
In fact, Kshama Sawant, isn't there a single payer referendum being considered, being put forward in Washington state where we are right now?
Exactly. That's exactly right. There's an attempt to a referendum on single-payer healthcare in Washington. This is being done by grassroots activists. That's what's important. In California, there is a real energy in the grassroots, in the movements, to push for single-payer healthcare. So the question really that we should be asking is, why is, when the majority of people want single-payer, why is it that the most prominent Democrat, Nancy Pelosi, said that single-payer will not be in the Democratic Party platform? Why is it that in Democratic-dominated states, Washington, Oregon, California, all of these have Democratic governors? Why isn't it that they are joining? Why aren't the prominent Democrats joining the movements on the ground and saying, let's fight for single-payer healthcare, let's tax the rich, let's make sure we have a West Coast white single-payer healthcare? If they did that, if Jerry Brown, the governor of California, woke up today and said, I want to fight for single-payer healthcare with you, he would get a huge echo and they would win. But instead, he's an obstacle to that. And so, and he said, I don't know how we can do this. And
we have 10 seconds.
And that shows that ultimately movements are working people's, young people's movements. We cannot rely on corporate Democrats. We will have to build independently of the corporate Democrats and fight for single-payer health care.
Kshama Sawant, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Socialist City Council member here in Seattle. She spearheaded the movement to win a $15 an hour minimum wage for all workers in Seattle. She's a member of the Socialist Alternative. When we come back, an attorney who is suing Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General of the United States. We'll find out why, and we'll talk about the dramatic situation that's developing at Hanford here in Washington, D.C., around radioactive materials. Stay with us.
Stay out on the levee, watching the seagulls fly. My heart was feeling heavy, did not know the reason why. I was crying for you, wherever you may be. I was crying for you, 'cause you once were me.
Young Blood Blues by Alinda Segarra and Hooray for the Riff Raff. You can see our whole interview with Alinda and the musical performances in our studios at DemocracyNow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now! We're broadcasting from Seattle, Washington. On Monday, a federal appeals court in Richmond, Virginia, heard arguments over Trump's second Muslim ban, which sought to ban all refugees and citizens from 6 majority Muslim nations from entering the U.S. The 13 panel of judges appeared to be divided over the ban. Some said Trump's own statements showed the second travel ban still sought to unconstitutionally discriminate against people based on their religion. This is Judge Henry Floyd.
Shortly after the Executive Order 2 was signed, Sean Spicer said the principles remain the same. President Trump's statement, concurrent with that time, You know my plans. Spicer, President Trump yesterday continued to deliver on campaign promises. Is there anything other than willful blindness that would prevent us from getting behind those statements?
Another judge, Robert King, pointed out that until Monday, Trump's campaign website had continued to call for a, quote, total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, unquote. The White House removed that page during Monday's hearing after facing questions from reporters. Well, for more, we're joined here in Seattle by Matt Adams, legal director for the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, lead counsel for the class action lawsuit challenging the Trump administration's executive order. His lawsuit was filed in Seattle on behalf of 3 parents legally living in the U.S. who are now restricted from bringing their children from Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Matt Adams, welcome back to Democracy Now! Explain what your lawsuit is all about and how Jeff Sessions is also one of your targets.
Thank you. Yes, so our lawsuit is parallel to what's happening in Maryland, and now that will be reviewed here in Seattle, Washington, the lawsuit brought by Hawaii challenging the Muslim ban. Ours differs in that ours is on behalf of U.S. citizen and lawful permanent residents who have filed immigrant visa petitions for their spouses and children are being separated from them because of the ban, or at least until the court intervened and placed a hold on Trump's ban. So it brings up from the perspective of those who are directly affected and separated from their loved ones. Now, just to be clear, this is separate from our lawsuit challenging the Department of Justice and Sessions' actions targeting Northwest Immigrant Rights Project in particular.
So can you talk about how you've taken on Jeff Sessions? Your group, the Northwest Immigrants' Rights Project, filing a lawsuit in federal district court challenging an order from the Department of Justice that instructs your group to cease and desist from assisting unrepresented immigrants in deportation proceedings, the DOJ saying that your group can't provide legal help to undocumented immigrants unless it undertakes formal representation of the clients. Their letter said your group, Northwest Immigrant Rights Project's practice of representing aliens before the Executive Office for Immigration Review without filing the appropriate notice of entry of appearance form is in violation of federal regulations, and I say that in quotes. We don't use that word aliens. Matt Adams, talk about what Justice is alleging, what Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, is saying here and saying you cannot do.
What they're saying is that if we encounter someone who doesn't have legal representation, that we are unable, we're being ordered to refrain from assisting those individuals unless we take on their case for full representation. But of course, what this means is the vast majority of individuals will not receive any legal assistance. So for example, just 40 minutes south of Seattle is a detention center where 1,500 individuals are locked up. Of those 1,500 people, 90% of them do not have an attorney. Our organization represents as many as we can, but that's just a small portion of the 1,500 individuals who are locked up. So in addition to the hundreds of people that we help out and take on for full representation, we provide workshops, we help others fill out application forms, we help them file motions to reopen cases, and now the Department of Justice has said, no, if you are not taking on full representation, then you are ordered to cease and desist helping those individuals. This is something we've been doing for 30 years, providing limited services. This is something that nonprofit organizations all across the country do to help out unrepresented individuals in deportation proceedings. And yet the government is relying on a regulation that they implemented in 2009, supposedly to target attorney misconduct and notario fraud, to say that, no, it would not be fair to the unrepresented immigrants if we provided them this assistance without taking on their full case, knowing very well that we don't have the resources to take on their case, and knowing very well that the government does not provide them with appointed counsel. The one last point I'd make on that, what's most ironic is that for the last 6 years, we have been litigating against the federal government for their failure to provide attorneys for people in removal proceedings, saying that that makes a mockery of the constitutional requirement that they receive a fair hearing. And one of the government's defenses all along has been, well, there's a lot of other things that can be done to help these people, like these limited services that are provided to them. And yet now they turn around and order us to stop providing those limited services.
Matt Adams, I want to thank you for being with us. Legal director for the Northwest Immigrants' Rights Project, lead counsel for the class action lawsuit challenging the Trump administration's executive order. His lawsuit filed here in Seattle on behalf of 3 parents living legally in the U.S. who are now restricted from bringing their kids from Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. As we turn now to our last segment, and we continue to focus on what's happening at a state and local level, that's happening all over the country. Next week, we'll be traveling throughout California and broadcasting throughout there. You can check our website at democracynow.org to see where we'll be. But right here in Washington State, where the Department of Energy declared a state of emergency at the Hanford nuclear site after a tunnel storing contaminated radioactive materials collapsed, is the subject of our last segment. The collapse, which was discovered Tuesday, forced hundreds of workers to take cover, to shelter in place, to avoid potential exposure. Local station King 5 obtained this video from a worker describing the scene.
All personnel report to their respective lunchrooms for further information and/or instructions. All personnel should refrain from eating or drinking until told it is safe to do so.
Well, so it's either a drill or an emergency. Gotta take cover.
Hanford is the nation's most polluted nuclear weapons production site. The site's been leaking radioactive waste on and off for years. The Energy Department claims no radioactive contamination has been reported so far from Tuesday's tunnel collapse. But Edwin Lyman from the Union of Concerned Scientists said, quote, collapse of the earth covering the tunnels could lead to a considerable radiological release, unquote. Well, now the state of Washington's Department of Ecology's nuclear waste program has announced on Twitter it's taken legal action against Hanford. For more, we're joined here in Seattle by Tom Carpenter, executive director of Hanford Challenge, which advocates for workers at the Hanford nuclear site. Tom, welcome to Democracy Now! Explain what's taken place. I mean, given what's happening in Washington, D.C., there's very little national awareness about what you're dealing with here in Washington.
Okay, so this is the nation's most contaminated site in the state of Washington here. It was built to make nuclear weapons and plutonium for those weapons, and now we're left with this legacy of radioactive waste. And so what recently happened on Tuesday morning was one of the facilities at this site suffered a collapse of a tunnel holding the vast quantities of very highly dangerous radioactive materials. Now, the government is saying that none of that escaped, except radiation itself into the sky, but no particles escaped. And so now the question really remains is that true? Were workers contaminated? It appears not. But what is the next? What's the next shoe that's going to fall? So what's in this tunnel? Right? So we know that there are chemicals, there are explosive materials, there could be fires that happen. So we're all watching with bated breath.
Can you explain what the Purex is, the plutonium-uranium extraction plant?
Yes, so this was a facility that was used to dissolve spent nuclear fuel made in nuclear reactors on the shores of the Columbia River. They had 9 reactors. And this facility would dissolve this stuff in acid, separate out the plutonium, and they had this very large inventory of highly radioactive and chemical waste products left over. That's what's at Hanford now.
Can you explain the history of the Hanford site and its role in the U.S. nuclear program?
Sure. Hanford was the first production facility that came out of the work at Los Alamos during World War II. So it made the plutonium for the very first nuclear test in the deserts of New Mexico, and was the plutonium dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, in the Fat Man bomb. So it went on then to make more and more plutonium And it does this by irradiating uranium slugs and then taking that irradiated uranium, dissolving that in a process called reprocessing. And Hanford became the most contaminated facility as a result. It's hard to describe exactly how bad this place is. It's got 2/3 of the nation's high-level nuclear waste. There's just 56 million gallons of this waste in underground leaking tanks. This one little tunnel that was the subject of Tuesday's collapse was really a small thing compared to what else is out at that site. So you can imagine a collapse of a nuclear waste tank containing millions of curies of radioactivity. You're talking about a multi-state disaster. And those tanks are in no better shape than this tunnel. And that's the concern, is that the federal government spent trillions of dollars to make nuclear weapons, but it's shortchanging us on the cleanup at these sites. It's supposed to take years and years. The money is being stolen. It's a fraud factory in a way. And, so the public is really getting shafted on this one.
So very quickly, you've sued the federal government on behalf of the workers at Hanford. We have less than a minute. Can you explain what you have sued over, what you're demanding, and with this latest accident, what needs to happen?
Okay, so we brought a lawsuit along with a union at the Hanford site, the Pipefitters Union and the state of Washington, to force the government to provide better protections for the workers out there who inhale chemical vapors and then get sick. And sadly, people are not being protected, even though there are some pretty grave health injuries that result, and we are demanding that people are protected with respiratory protection into the future, and that they do something to protect these people. This latest incident is a great illustration of how workers are on the front lines of harm out there.
Well, Tom, I want to thank you for being with us. Tom Carpenter, Executive Director of Hanford Challenge, which advocates for workers at the Hanford nuclear site. That does it for our show. I'm heading back to New York on Friday night as we continue our multi-city tour covering the movements changing America. I'll be speaking in New York City Friday night at the New School at the Tishman Auditorium on 5th Avenue, just under 14th Street at 7 p.m. On Saturday, that is May 13th, I'll be in Olympia, Washington, at the Capitol Theater at 11 a.m., then at Powell's Books at Cedars Hills Crossing in Beaverton, Oregon, right outside Portland, Saturday night at 5. Then off to California. We'll be stopping in Eureka Sunday at noon at the Sequoia Conference Center, at 7 p.m. Berkeley at the First Presbyterian Church. And then on Monday in Santa Cruz. In the evening, we'll be in Palo Alto, Tuesday in San Diego, then Los Angeles, then Santa Barbara, and we're going beyond. We'll be in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We'll be in Tempe, Arizona, and finally in Houston, Texas. You can check the website, DemocracyNow.org, and you can apply for a full-time one-year video production fellowship at Democracy Now! And 6 months internships as well. Visit DemocracyNow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.